how do we sell the idea of things that we need to ditch?
Yes.
I think it comes down to just having a frank conversation with people that are stuck in old thinking. And I think people need to be more reflective of, and this isn't everyone, but I think there are certain executives that are stuck in a mindset of things that worked 8, 10 years ago are always going to work. And that's not true, right? Just because it worked 10 years ago, 5 years ago, doesn't mean it's going to work today. And that whole mindset needs to be done away with.
Welcome to the B2B Digital Marketer Podcast, a podcast helping you to end your struggle with digital marketing, helping you to pave a new and better path to target and capture your ideal customer. Each week, we teach you how insiders and experts debunk the dreary and become engines of innovation. Now, here's your host, Jim Rembach.
Okay, B2B DM gang. Hey, this is going to be a great discussion today because we're not just going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the next thing that you should be thinking about, which is right now. That is top B2B content strategies to ditch in 2023 with Mark Raffan. Mark, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim. I really appreciate it.
Now, we're going to hit on three things that people need to be thinking about right now for their 2023. Even though we're saying we're close to that middle time frame in 2022, a lot of times when you start talking about marketing, sales, all of those things, we start waiting till that end of that third or fourth calendar quarter, to start doing some planning for 2023. And the reality is, if you do that, you're too freaking late.
Yeah, it's way too late. Like if you're starting to plan in November, December for the next year, it's too late. I know that sounds fairly aggressive for a lot of people because they're like, hey, that's my planning time, right? That's when I start to plan. Like, what are you saying, Mark? But if you're getting there now, it's like, and I've heard some people are planning for 2022, which is where we are now, in February of 2022. I'm like, guys, listen, we've missed the boat, right? We're just playing catch up.
Well, yes. And in today's world, when you start talking about B2B content, B2B content strategies, if you want to call it demand gen, lead gen, whatever you want to call it, is that everybody is putting significantly more resources and have finally come to the realization that this isn't a nice to have anymore. This is a need to have. It needs to be part of what we do in order to grow our organization. Well, and quite frankly, survive.
Yeah. Well, and the only way to succeed going forward in today's day and age, especially with all the things that we've got going on social media and content that are being produced by the vast majority of all of the listeners' competitors, is that if you're not producing great content on the right channels for the right things, you're getting left behind in a big way, because the way that people consume data, the way that people consume information, and how people reach out to salespeople now has totally changed in the last 2 years, right? 84%, I think, is the statistic of people have already researched your company significantly before they even reach out. So if you don't have content that guides them through that research process on all the channels where they hang out, they're not going to be reaching out to you. They're going to be reaching out to your competitors.
Well, and I would even add on to that. So let's say, well, we don't necessarily, have situations, or because of, our ideal customer profile or the personas that we're going after, a lot of times it's me making the initial touch, but then what they're doing is they're checking you out, right?
Of course. Yeah, all the time. All the time. They're checking your website out. They're checking your content on your website out. They're checking your ratings out on G2 or Clutch or wherever you have ratings. They're asking questions about you on Slack channels that they're a part of. They're going to organizations like Pavilion, the marketers organization, to ask questions about that. They're going to be checking you out in a big way.
Most definitely. Okay, so now before we get even deeper in this to discussion, please let the B2B DM gang know a little bit about you and your background.
Well, thank you very much for having me again. My background is actually not in marketing. I don't come from that background. I come from the sales and procurement world and spent most of my career there and started an organization about 5 years ago called Negotiations Ninja, which is a negotiation training and coaching company. And we built that business up to be one of the leading negotiation training brands on the planet through content marketing. And then a few years ago, we decided, listen, if we could do this for one company, I bet we could probably do it for others. So we started out Content Callout, which is now one of the leading B2B content marketing agencies in the world. And we do exactly that. We develop amazing B2B content for growing tech companies, specifically in the B2B SaaS space, and help them to leverage their awareness brand across all channels that they want to be present in.
You know, as you're saying that, Mark, I start thinking about, negotiating in regards to today's, marketplace, and how the psychology of negotiation absolutely does play significantly into what we're talking about in regards to,
yes,
especially high ticket, B2B sales. But then I start thinking about, oh my gosh, a lot of this is really a one-sided negotiation because you're not getting the insight and the information, from the person who you're trying to negotiate with. And initially you're trying to negotiate for their attention, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So
and the principles of negotiation and the principles of influence and the principles of marketing are very closely tied. And that's what we realized when we were building up Content Callout, is that we, especially if you read any of Childini's work and you read about social proof and reciprocity and all that kind of stuff that he talks about in influence, it becomes very clear that a lot of those same principles still apply in the marketing world as well. And you may not necessarily get the immediate feedback right away, but you're going to get it when you get the call.
Yeah. So I actually went to Arizona State University and went through a Childini workshop many, many years ago, and had the opportunity to meet Dr. Childini. And it was really interesting. Some of the, you talk about the principles, and by the way, he just came out with a new book with an additional principle.
I did see that.
Yes, is a lot of times they get misconstrued and twisted in the way that we apply them, which to me was very enlightening. So, like for example, liking. He talks about liking. We've always grown up this way, and we've been conditioned this way. Well, you need to get people to like you, and he said that's really false-minded. He said what we need to do is we need to let people know and understand that we like them. I was like,
yes.
Whoa, that's kind of like the hack on liking that we miss.
Yes. Yeah. It's unfortunate that I think a lot of the work has been misconstrued around the stuff that he talks about, especially when it comes to like authority and stuff like that. People tend to take that one direction or another. But I think if you read the original work, it becomes very clear.
Well, and also talking about the original work, he has talked about that. And he said, and originally when he started all that work, it was to really prevent the common public from being duped by marketers. He goes, but what ended up happening, the commercial appeal was to marketers on how to dupe the general public. And really, you have to kind of think about that, is that, there's where your values come in and the culture of an organization come in. And so we're going to talk about really three things that organizations need to focus in on for 2023 that can oftentimes, maybe, get into those particular areas in regards to, mindset, focus, influence. And so you and I had talked before we started recording about three things that people really need to ditch, in 2023. So if you could, please launch us into one of those.
Yeah, the first one that I really want to talk about is this whole idea that you need to control your employees' social media presence online, specifically on LinkedIn or Twitter, where you think your customers are going to be most active. I think that's very old thinking. And I think that Dr. Childini would actually approve of us ditching that in the future, especially if you start to think of the ability to create social proof and authority online. You want your people to be present in the marketplace where you are selling into. That's the whole idea. It's like you wouldn't stop your employees from having a networking conversation at a conference, right? So why would you stop them from posting stuff on LinkedIn? It's essentially the same question. And so when you're doing that, when you're trying to stop them from posting that stuff or trying to control them from posting it, what you're essentially doing is you're limiting your ability to create authority and to create social proof with your customers. And when you do that, you're limiting your reach. And the fact is that personal profiles on LinkedIn specifically, on average, get 5 to 20x the reach that a company page does organically. So if you're purely relying on your company page on LinkedIn, you've lost the plot. Don't do that anymore. Stop trying to control your employees' social media presence. Instead, what you should be doing is encouraging them to post, and then giving them the assets and the copy and all of the things that they need to have in order to position themselves as thought leaders within the space that you're selling into. Because the more that your employees are seen as thought leaders in that space, the easier it is going to be to attract views, and the easier it is to close sales. Because now what you're doing is you're positioning your organization as a company of thought leaders. And when the sales come through, it's way easier. And remember earlier on, we spoke about the whole idea of, hey, look, your customers are going to check you out. Guess where they're going to check you out first? LinkedIn.
Well, as you started talking about that, I started thinking about the whole skill development on how to do that, right? And I'll give you a quick example. I know somebody who's very close to me who is an accountant, and she said that their organization was having global training on how to actually, create a better LinkedIn profile. Because again, they're wanting to do what you just said, right? Have greater brand presence, have personal presence, personal brand presence, and the thing is, when you start talking about the skills, if I'm going to accountants and saying, hey, I need you to create a particular profile, that's not going to happen, Barry. That's not a skill set they have been building, right? That's why
you got to give them the resources and the training.
You absolutely do.
Yeah. You absolutely have to, because if you don't do that, then you're missing out, number one, on a massive opportunity for your organization. And number two, you're also hurting your employees' potential to improve their career down the line. The main argument that I get around this is like, well, what if they develop so much of a personal brand that they get poached by someone else? Well, then you probably weren't paying them enough and your culture sucked. So you need to fix that as well. So if you're worried that your employees are going to get poached by someone else, maybe you should look inward on that conversation and say, listen, maybe we can do better in these particular areas.
Right. And all these things too, that you're talking about is sometimes, the lawyers may get involved, and that's where a lot of that squashing of social communication and social presence and things like that comes into play, is when the lawyers get involved. Well, when the lawyers get involved, you have to ask from a company culture perspective, are they getting involved too soon? Right. And they're just squashing the opportunity for us to develop, and grow, the skills and all of that, or are they getting involved late, because we've had situations and incidences, right? But again,
and that's where the training comes in.
Yeah.
Right. That as long as there's consistent training over and over and over again, and you give them the resources that they need to be successful, and then you coach them on how to do it and how not to do it. Look, there's going to be screw ups. Someone's going to say something that they shouldn't have said. It's going to happen. So plan for that. Make sure that you're ready for that. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. Look, risk isn't binary. It's not like, oh, if risk was binary, we wouldn't cross the street. Right? We would just say, okay, I got to stay on this side because there's a risk to me crossing the street. I don't want to get hit by a car. No, it's got to do with probability and then impact. So what is the probability of the risk occurring? And then what's the impact if that risk does occur? If the probability is high, let's mitigate against that. Let's give them the training. Let's give them the resources. Let's bring in an agency like ours to be able to show how to do it and even manage that communication for people if they're too busy, right? Like this whole idea that we want to control it because the risk is too high is bananas. You can mitigate against that. at risk. And if you don't do it, if you don't give them the training, if you don't give them the skills, then you're putting your organization at risk because they're going to do it anyway.
That's very true. And I also have noticed that when you start talking about effectiveness, and this is oftentimes is now a very big problem, meaning that when we're trying to use the brand or as our driver for doing this. And here's what I mean by that. If we look at currently what exists in regards to the B2B buyer and the B2B buyer journey, if we are pushing brand, they may not want to connect to our biz dev people because they know what's coming, right? And nobody wants to be sold to anymore. Everybody wants
people, Jim. People trust people.
That's exactly right. And so you have to be like, for example, there's certain things like you, I was a sales guy that had to learn marketing. I was forced into doing it, and it was, survive or not. I mean, the other side. And so therefore, when I start looking at, certain marketing activities from those different segments and what we're trying to accomplish, whether I'm building a brand or whether I'm trying to acquire customers, is there's certain things that you just should not be putting out front. There's certain things you should not be saying. There's certain and if you give it to marketing to create those profiles, they're going to muck it up because that's where they came from, right? They're all about brand. And so you have to really look at that. Otherwise, your influence factor is going to go in a tank.
Yeah, and I would say I'll push back a little bit on that. I would say it depends on the marketing department, right? So it depends on the organization. It depends on the marketing department. But if we're talking about like the classic old school, manufacturing type environment where there's 1 to 2 marketing people and they do billboards and they do conferences, then yeah, they probably don't necessarily have the insight, and maybe they need some coaching along the way as well. So if you want to get marketing to help those people that you build the profiles for, awesome. Maybe your marketing department maybe needs a little bit of coaching too. And that's okay. It's okay to recognize that.
And that is that. And so then that's what you just elaborated a little bit more of what I was referring to. If you go the traditional route, it could undermine your sales, generation and activities.
Right.
Okay. So now you talked about, a linear aspect of this, but there's also something that's quite linear in regards to the thinking, in regards to attribution with content. So tell us a little bit about what we need to debunk, rethink, and avoid for 2023.
Yeah, I want people to ditch the whole idea that attribution with content is linear. So typically, like 5-6 years ago, a lot of people would be of the mindset that, okay, if we're going to create content, we're going to have that content have certain keywords in it so that when someone searches for those keywords, that content's going to show up on Google. They're going to click on that content. That drives them down a content funnel, right? From an awareness piece to a consideration piece to an intent or action piece. And it's going to be all fairly linear. And then they're going to click book a meeting or talk to someone at the end. And everyone's going to be super happy because we can see the attribution of all of the content all the way back to the beginning. And we can say, okay, here's the linear progression of movement for people from awareness to action. That's bullshit. That's not a real thing. That doesn't happen in the real world. Where people go to is they have conversations on dark social being communities that they're a part of, whether they're Slack communities or other communities that they may be a part of, like marketing organizations or associations or friend groups or whatever it is. They get directed to a podcast like yours, where they're like, oh, I heard this Mark guy on this podcast, and that sounds interesting. Maybe I'll go research him a little bit more. They go to the website. They do a little bit of searching on the website. They maybe read a little bit of 2 or 3 pieces. Then they go to G2 or Clutch, and they're like, what is this person actually like? And I'm not really ready to make a decision yet, but I kind of keep that in the back of my mind. And then we're retargeting them with ads because they came onto the website. And so it's all over the place, Jim. So for people to be able to say it's a linear progression on content, that's not a thing anymore. Don't believe that. Don't associate that. You've got to be a little bit more forgiving when it comes to attribution of content that's being generated. It all helps. It's all important as a part of the funnel. We're not saying that it's not important, but what we are saying is that it's not going to be a clear line.
Well, as you're saying that, I start thinking about my initial thinking in regards to that, and some of it I think goes into the whole, target planning and persona planning, and who is my target, right? If I start thinking that they themselves are quite linear, meaning that it's this type of person, you know what I mean? It's that's going to be a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think once people start wrapping their heads around how they would search for something, then it becomes easy for you to, like, people to recognize that it's obviously not linear. Like, I'm not going to read a piece of content and then read 3 more pieces of content and watch a webinar and then make a decision. The likelihood of that happening as in B2B is so low because we're spending an inordinate amount of money on B2B solutions, right? Your average B2B solution is going to be between 50 grand and 50 million, depending on the thing that you're buying, right? And so someone's not going to make a purchase decision or action to buy without going to a variety of different sources all over the place all the time to see what information they can garner and gather so that they can put together in their heads whether or not this is a good decision for them. So the whole linear concept doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense.
Well, even as you're talking, I start thinking about the total shifts that have happened within organizational buying teams, right? Yeah. So just kind of like what you're talking about, I may have been the person who, consumed that piece of content originally, but then where did it go? Right. Some of these things you can track, some of these things you can't, but then you look at, from an organizational perspective, who is part of that buying team. And a lot of times they're just not visible to you.
Yeah. And what's going to end up happening is, like, look, let's just say, for example, you are in the market to buy a new accounting software. And so you know all the big players right away, and you're a multinational organization. So you're thinking SAP, Oracle, but you got to have someone else come to the table because you can't just go to market to them. And so you start researching those additional vendors that may be involved. So you take that information to your procurement team and say, hey, I want to put together an RFP for all these particular people. These are the people that I want to include on the RFP. We're particularly interested in these 2 top things. Please go ahead and source this information so we can have conversations with them. So where was the linear attribution there? Like it just didn't exist.
Well, as you were saying that, I'm like, hey, so for me, what I want to do is help my clients get to be the ones to where if they have to go to the RFP process, that the RFP process goes something like this. Well, these are the comparables, but this is the one I want.
Yeah, exactly. That's ideally if you're the marketer or the salesperson of the organization that is a part of that RFP, that's the ideal situation. You want to be top of mind for the people that are going to be making the decision. The only way to be top of mind for those people is to be constantly present in the areas where they hang out. Where do they hang out? You have to decide that for yourself as an organization. But then you have to have content that's suitable for those people in all those areas all the time. So when we're thinking about like being top of mind and that whole linear idea, it just can't be linear.
No, it's not. Well, and also too, when you start throwing in the aspects of timelines, right? A lot of organizations, because of the shifts that have happened with COVID, their average sales cycle has, added another 6 months to it.
Right.
Some people have said, that, hey, actually it cut ours in half. Okay. But here's the thing. Was it cut in half because of the factors in regards to your particular solution? And is it going to stay that way? And the answer is no.
That's an interesting question.
It's no. So it's like, okay, going back to hey, we need to stop thinking about where we are now. We need to start thinking about, 2023 when that particular issue is no longer an issue.
Right.
Right. Because goodness knows, when something like that happens and there's crisis moments, there's also, there's all these competitors that I didn't have before, right? There's all these factors that come into play. So that's good insight. We need to think about attribution quite differently for 2023. And I think that also leads into what we're getting ready to talk about now is that, we think, okay, because of that, I now need to be omnipresent. And you're saying no.
No, you do not need to be omnipresent.
So what do we need to ditch for 2023 in regards to omnipresence thinking?
Yeah, don't ditch the idea that you need to be on every single conceivable channel. Your buyers aren't there. They're just not. They're not on every single channel. So focus on the areas that make sense for your organization. Think about where the people that are making purchasing decisions and the people that influence those people that make purchasing decisions hang out. Where do they go to? That is where you should double down, triple down, quadruple down, whatever you need to do. Maybe it's 1 or 2 channels. You probably aren't going to need more than that, but don't spread yourself too thin. I see people do this all the time. They're on like 5 different social media networks. They have 3 different emails. They are creating 50, webinars per quarter. You don't need to boil the ocean. Think about how they consume the information, where they hang out, and then think about what are the strategies that you're going to do to reach them in those areas, and then quadruple down on those things. That's where you need to think. Ditch the idea that you need to be across all channels.
Yeah, and as you're saying that, I start thinking about what a lot of people will say too, and this, I think this plays into it, is that they start having this small guy syndrome. So there's some truth to that, meaning that you're not going to outspend, you talked about some of these organizations, you're not going to outspend an SAP. You're not going to outspend an Oracle. You're not going to do it. So you have to consider, well, do I need to put a whole lot of effort being on G2? Do I need to be in the magic quadrant? Do I really need to do all of those things? The answer could very well be, no, you don't need to do that. Right?
Potentially not, right? Like, you got to think about where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. Where are you going to spend the most effort and the most time that's going to deliver the most results? And when we talk about most results, we're talking, especially in the context of content, we're talking about where is my content going to get consumed? That's all that you should really care about when it comes to B2B content marketing, is where is my content going to get consumed? Because if your content is good and you've got eyes on it, you're playing the game right.
Well, and as you start talking about attention and attribution models, and we start talking about these things, I oftentimes have this discussion with folks to where I'm sharing with them in regards to their line of sight. If you think about crosshairs, where are my crosshairs? Where's my target? Yeah, it's too low within the organization. I mean, and if you think about it very well is, because and there's that whole, well, we're small syndrome that plays into that mindset, and a lot of it's self-limiting, and they're like, well, we can't get into the C-suite or with senior level executives. We can't. Now there are some truths, and I want us to be very clear. Depending on your ideal customer profile, they may not be spending a whole lot of time on social. You need to think about what those people are doing, right? So you have an attention issue, right? It's hard to get their attention. But then again, that goes talking about am I using a shotgun, or am I using the crosshairs and the rifle approach, saying, well, okay, this is the person we want. So therefore, in order to do that, I don't need to do that. I don't need to do that. I don't need to do that. I need to do this and be freaking awesome at it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. We want people to be as focused as they can be with the kind of content that everything starts with intention, Jim, right? Like, it starts with, who am I trying to reach? And why am I trying to reach them? And what do I want to tell them? And where do I want to engage them in the conversation? And when you can start with those types of questions, then the creation of content becomes easier, because then it becomes much more focused and you're able to double down on those areas that you should.
That's a very good point. I happen to, there's a, back in my younger days and ages, and my, seeking of insight and information, I came across this one guy named Michael Boylan, who wrote a couple books. And he was referring to the issue of the gatekeeper in the organization, when you're trying to get, senior level access.
Yeah.
And he in this book was talking about that it's been an issue for a couple decades. This is what he was saying when he wrote the book. And the book was written in 1989.
Yeah, some things don't change.
So it's
some things don't change,
but it doesn't mean that it can't be accomplished, right?
Oh yeah.
And I think too, some of these things, when you start referring to, like, for example, G2 Magic Quadrant and things like that, and and the saying in the industry goes, well, nobody got fired from hiring, IBM, as far as technology is concerned, right? I think that's a limiting belief if you kind of approach things and create strategies with that in mind.
Yeah, and that may be true, but also, like, I like to think of it from the perspective of, like, yeah, no one got fired hiring SAP, and at the same time, how fast did they innovate, right? Like, right. So
to me, with SAP, it's like, but how much did they like it?
Yeah, exactly. How many T codes do you remember that you have to be able to enter into SAP all the time? Yeah.
So people usually talk about SAP and they're like, oh.
Yeah, I've had really good experiences. In their defense, I've had really good experiences, and then I've also had the opposite, right? So I think it depends on it depends on a number of different factors. But I think the whole idea behind spreading yourself too thin because you think you have to be like them, you have to be like the Oracle, you can't do it. Look, they can outspend you in every area 50 times over. So why are you doing that?
Exactly.
Right? Like, be targeted, be focused.
Yeah, don't let the Bible a story of David and Goliath fool you in regards to that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Don't go head to head.
You're not David.
No,
you're not David.
No.
Yeah.
Not going to happen.
Yeah.
But there is a weakness, right? And that's, there is truth to that. But it's not going head to head, right?
Yeah, you can't. You can't do that. You can't go head to head with them. In terms of marketing spend, you'll get killed.
And I think that was part of the story too. And a lot of people just, if you peel it back in a high level, you're like, well, David beat Goliath. There was a small guy beating the big guy. But how did he do it, right? He was clever, cunning, and he didn't fight the same fight. You can't either.
Yeah. There's who wrote that book? Is it Malcolm Gladwell that wrote the book on fight David and Goliath? I can't remember what the story.
I think he did. I haven't read it.
There's some additional information that Malcolm Gladwell dives into there, where he says, yeah, and also David had been slinging a sling every day of his life for 15, 16 years, all day, every day. He was fast, he was nimble, he was quick. Like, there's so many things that we don't think about when we hear the story that apply in those cases.
Most definitely. Yeah. And I think that's what we're really talking about here. Even when we start talking about, like, our personas and our ideal customers, if you just stay at the surface level, right, you're missing the big opportunity. We got to get into those, psychological factors that you have leveraged, right, in regards to, the negotiation world, that can and should be leveraged, within the marketing and content, management and lead generation realm.
Yeah, totally agree with you.
So to me, that leaves kind of, because I always try to find, give you some background and context on where I'm thinking about this and where we want to go is in the world of positive psychology, which ultimately, if you think about what will enable the greatest level of impact, it's to focus in on positive psychology, not SWOT analysis, right? It's not the weaknesses and the threats that will actually enable you to be successful. You can't focus on those. You have to look on, more of the positive things, the aspirations, the results we want to get, and things like that. And so within the realm of positive psychology, they talk about something referred to as unlikely pairs, which from an innovative and creative thinking perspective is what we really need to focus in on, is unlikely pairs. And if you think about unlikely pairs, what they talk about, a lot of organizations, when they're trying to solve problems, they will get into a groupthink problem where they pair people up that think the same way, right? You're not going to challenge each other.
Right.
But for example, if I put, a marketing person with an engineer, that's an unlikely pair. Now, are those people going to eat lunch together? Yeah. They're not going to be eating lunch together and hanging out in the break room together. And, that's typically not the case, right?
Right.
But if we put them together in regards to the creative thinking process, what comes out of that, if we facilitate it correctly, it's phenomenal.
Right.
They're unlikely pairs. So you have to think about that when you're looking for ways to innovate within your own organization. You have to look for things outside of your industry, outside of your type of culture, all outside of your type of individual, your ICP, in order to be able to innovate and be creative thinking, within your own organization. So unlikely pairs needs to be a mindset that you're always focusing in on if you really want to ditch things that you shouldn't be doing.
Right. Yeah, okay. I like that. I've never heard of that. I'm going to look into it.
It's very, very powerful. And for me, as you were talking, it reminded me of it. I was like, that's exactly right. And now the hardest part with that, when you do the unlikely pairs, is selling the idea. So, okay, we've talked about things we need to ditch, right? How do we sell the idea of it?
How do we sell the idea of things that we need to ditch?
Yes.
I think it comes down to just having a frank conversation with people that are stuck in old thinking. And I think people need to be more reflective of, and this isn't everyone, but I think there are certain executives that are stuck in a mindset of things that worked 8-10 years ago are always going to work. And that's not true, right? Just because it worked 10 years ago, 5 years ago, doesn't mean it's going to work today. And that whole mindset needs to be done away with. The classic line is like, oh, we've always done it this way, or we've been doing it this way for 20 years. And whenever I hear that kind of thinking, I'm like, okay, great. And if it's worked, amazing. And things have dramatically changed in the last 2 years, like on its head changed. So for you to think that you can keep applying that same old knowledge may not necessarily be true. It might, depending on your industry, who knows? But I think you need to challenge yourself and challenge your own thinking to be like, okay, am I stuck in a rut here? I'm not getting the same results that I was getting before, but I keep investing in the same thing. And so that whole sunk cost mindset comes in where you're like, well, we just keep doing it, right? And so there's this successive investing in ideas of like, well, it worked before, and so now I've got a bias that will continue to work, and we're just in a bad patch, but if I keep investing, it's going to come back. And do you know it's going to come back? Start to challenge your own ideas about whether or not it will. And then you can start to think, okay, well, maybe the smart guy's not crazy, right? Like maybe we need to have a conversation.
All right, man. Status quo bias lives in all of us. Yeah, I think you bring a very important point there. Okay, so I'm sitting here. I'm a B2B digital marketer. You just told me I need to kick myself in the rear and I need to strategize for 2023 and get ahead of this because I'm already probably a little bit behind. What's one of the things I need to be thinking right now?
I would say that the biggest thing that I would like you to think about going into the remainder of 22 and into 23 is be intentional about the type of content you're creating for your target audience and the influencers of the target audience. So if you say to me, hey, Mark, the target persona for this particular ICP is the CFO, and we want to reach out to the CFO, recognize that the CFO alone doesn't make that decision. There are influencers of that CFO. So how are we going to influence those people with our marketing? And start with that intention. Who is the target persona? Who are the influencers of that target persona? How am I going to reach out to those people in my marketing tactics? And then if you can start with that, everything else becomes easier.
That's a really, really good piece of insight and information. Is we don't necessarily just think about that one persona. It's also who's impacting and influencing them.
Right.
Mark, man, it was an awesome discussion. How does the B2B DM gang get in touch with you?
Best place to reach out to me is, surprisingly or not surprisingly, on LinkedIn. You can reach out to me directly there. Just type in my name, Mark Raffan, or go to the website, contentcallout.com. And happy to have a discussion with anyone. I'm a big fan of knowing where people come from. So if you listen to this show and you say to me, hey, Mark, I listened to you with Jim, just let me know that in the message. I'll connect with you. We'll have a great conversation. We'll talk about the amazing podcast that Jim has and all of the impact that he's making.
Mark Raffan, thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom, and we wish you the very best.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, hey.
Thank you for joining us. Go now to join the B2B DM gang in the B2B Marketer LinkedIn group, where you can connect with other B2B DM disruptors and get access to our B2B DM cheat sheets, checklist, and guides. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, please help by going to iTunes to rate, review, and subscribe. And share the show on all of your digital platforms. Be sure to tune in next week for our next episode. And always remember, you can automate your lead capture, but you must lure your lead.